The sun was going down on the edge of the wide-open plains, and the little frontier town was beginning to fill with the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks, wagon wheels turning on the dirt road, and the familiar noise of the saloon piano. Dusty riders came in from the trail, tired and thirsty after long days of work. In that place, men often made quick trades, sometimes for cattle, sometimes for horses, and sometimes for things no one thought could be traded at all. On this evening, something happened that made people whisper for many years after. A cowboy named James had just returned from weeks of work, driving cattle across rough country. His clothes were worn, his boots covered in dust, and his hat pulled low against the evening sun. He was a man who had lived most of his life alone, his only companions being his horse and the wide-open sky. He had little money to his name, but enough to buy a drink at the saloon. As he pushed the door open, the smell of whiskey, sweat and smoke hit him, along with the noise of men shouting over card games. At one of the tables sat a trader, a man known for dealing in everything from blankets to barrels of flour. That evening, however, he had brought something else. By his side stood a woman, her dark hair braided, her face calm but distant, her eyes steady but unreadable. She was Apache, and though she said nothing, her presence was enough to draw stares. In that town, people rarely saw native women unless they had been captured or forced into a life not of their choosing. The trader boasted loudly, saying he would make a deal with anyone who had something worth offering. James walked closer, curious but quiet. He heard the trader laughing as he slapped his hand on a sack of wheat resting near his chair. "A sack like this and 2 bottles of whiskey and she's yours," the trader said with a grin. The saloon went silent for a moment. Some men laughed nervously, others looked away. It was the kind of trade that made people uncomfortable, but no one spoke against it. To them, it was just another rough act of frontier life. James did not laugh. He watched the woman closely. She did not lower her gaze, though many in her place would have looked down in shame. She stood straight, proud in her silence. Something about her made James pause. Perhaps it was the way her eyes seemed to look past the smoke and noise, as if she could still see the wide-open desert she had come from. Perhaps it was the strength in her posture, even while others looked at her as if she were nothing more than a possession. The trader expected no one to agree. Most men were not willing to bring such trouble into their homes. But James surprised everyone. He set his hand on the table and spoke simply. "I'll take the deal." His voice was calm, but his words carried weight in the quiet saloon. Gasps filled the room. One man muttered, "He's lost his mind." Another said, "That Apache woman will be the end of him." Others shook their heads, whispering about how foolish he was. James ignored them. He gave the trader what was asked, a sack of wheat from his wagon and 2 bottles of whiskey from the bar. The trader grinned, slapped the cowboy on the back, and left without another word, pleased to be rid of the burden. The woman still said nothing, but she turned her head slightly toward James. For a brief second, their eyes met. It was not a look of gratitude, nor was it a look of anger. It was something deeper, something he could not name. She seemed to be measuring him, wondering who this man was and why he had chosen to take her away from one kind of captivity into another uncertain future. As James led her out of the saloon, the townsfolk stared after them. Some smirked, some frowned, some shook their heads. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat, one man whispered. That's the price he paid for her. The words carried through the town like wind through the cottonwoods. By the time James saddled his horse and hitched his wagon, everyone in town had heard about the strange bargain. The ride back to his ranch was quiet. The evening air grew colder, and the stars began to spread across the sky. James glanced at the woman from time to time, but she kept her gaze forward, her face unreadable. He wondered if she was planning to run the moment she could, or if she thought of him as just another captor. He wanted to speak, but words failed him. Finally, he said softly, "My name's James." She gave no reply, only a small flicker in her eyes that told him she had at least heard. When they reached the ranch, James helped her down from the wagon. It was not a grand place, just a simple cabin with a barn, a few cattle, and stretches of dry land that were hard to keep alive. He pointed toward the house, unsure if she would follow. To his relief, she stepped inside without hesitation, though her eyes moved quickly, taking in every detail as if memorizing the space. That night, James fixed a simple meal of beans and bread. He offered her a share and she ate quietly, never once asking or speaking. He noticed how carefully she chewed, how sparingly she took each bite as though she had learned to make food last. After the meal, she sat by the small fire, her hands folded in her lap, her expression still unreadable. James lay awake long after she had curled up on a blanket near the fire. He could not stop thinking about what he had done. The 2 bottles of whiskey and sack of wheat were nothing compared to the weight of responsibility he now felt. He had brought home a woman who had her own story, her own pain, her own life that had been stolen by circumstances he barely understood. He wondered if she hated him for taking her, or if she felt relief to be away from the traitor. He did not know, and the not knowing made him restless. In the stillness of the night, James realized the truth. What he had done could not be measured by the simple trade. The whole town might talk about the price he paid, but he knew that the real cost was only beginning. The first morning on the ranch after the strange trade was quiet and cool. The sun had barely risen above the far hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. James stepped out of the cabin with his hat in hand, breathing in the fresh air, though his mind was heavy. The woman, still without a name he knew, was awake already. She had risen before him, and he found her standing outside, looking at the land that stretched endlessly around them. Her expression did not change, but her eyes studied every corner of the ranch, the barn, the corral, the dry fields where crops struggled, the cattle scattered in the distance. It was as if she were weighing it all, measuring whether this place was strong enough to survive the year. James cleared his throat softly and nodded toward the small barn. "I've got chores to do," he said in a calm voice. She didn't answer, only turned her head slightly, acknowledging him. Her silence was something he was beginning to notice. She was not empty or weak, but careful, as if her words were locked away behind a wall only she could open when she chose. He went to milk the single cow, expecting her to stay by the cabin. To his surprise, she followed him into the barn, her steps quiet. She stood a few feet away, watching his movements closely. When he struggled to keep the cow steady, she moved forward with calm confidence, placing her hand on the animal's side and whispering something in her own tongue. The cow settled almost instantly, no longer kicking at the bucket. James paused, startled, then gave a small nod of thanks. She said nothing, but there was a faint flicker in her eyes, a spark of knowledge and skill he had not expected. As the day went on, James worked the land as usual, repairing a broken fence, checking water troughs, and carrying feed. Each time the woman followed, never demanding, never complaining, but always watching. By afternoon, she began to act on her own, lifting boards to hold steady while he hammered, gathering tools without being asked, and even guiding a stray calf back into the corral. James noticed she moved with grace and understanding of the land, as though she had lived her life in close rhythm with animals and earth. Neighbors soon caught sight of her. A man named Carter rode past the ranch that day and stopped at the fence line, his face twisted with curiosity. Well, James," Carter said with a smirk. "Didn't think you'd go through with it. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat, that's all it took, huh? Folks in town are still talking." He laughed loudly, his voice sharp. James kept his tone steady. "You've had your laugh. Now move along," but Carter didn't move. His eyes turned toward the woman who stood near the barn door. Carter's grin faded into something cruel. "Don't say I didn't warn you. An Apache woman won't bring you anything but trouble." With that, he tugged his reins and rode off, leaving behind the dust and the sting of his words. James turned toward her, expecting fear or anger, but she stood still, her face calm, yet he could see the hurt hidden behind her quiet eyes. For the first time, he felt a strong need to shield her from the world's judgment, though he did not fully understand why. As the week went on, life settled into a new rhythm. She began to tend the cabin, sweeping the wooden floor, patching holes in the roof, and preparing food with what little they had. Her way of cooking was different. She used herbs James did not recognize, turning simple beans into something flavorful, turning plain bread into something hearty. He realized she carried with her knowledge that went beyond survival. She carried traditions. One evening, after a long day repairing a broken wagon wheel, James sat by the fire inside the cabin. He glanced at her as she mended a torn shirt with careful stitches. "Do you have a name?" he asked quietly. For a long moment, she kept her eyes on the fabric. Then, in a soft, accented voice, she spoke a single word. "Nia." James repeated it under his breath, It felt strange yet strong on his tongue. He nodded, then said, "Nia, that's a fine name." She gave the smallest of nods, then returned to her work. It was the first word she had shared with him, and though it was simple, it carried weight. It was a step toward trust. Days turned into weeks. James began to notice how Nia studied the sky, the soil, the animals. She could sense when the weather was about to change before a single cloud appeared. She knew how to find water by looking at the land and the way plants grew. She walked the edges of the ranch one morning and returned with wild herbs that could ease a cough. James had never seen anyone so attuned to nature, and he began to realize how valuable her knowledge was. But not everyone saw it the same way. When James went into town for supplies, whispers followed him. Men at the saloon laughed behind his back, calling him foolish. Women crossing the street whispered that Nia was dangerous, that she could not be trusted. James kept his head down, but the words stung. He knew Nia would never be welcomed in town, no matter how much good she did at the ranch. That evening, when he returned home, he found her tending the garden behind the cabin. She was kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds in careful rows. He crouched beside her, watching. "Why are you planting there?" "That ground's too dry," he said gently. She glanced at him, then pointed toward the horizon where the land dipped slightly. With a few gestures in broken English, she explained that rainwater would flow toward that patch of ground and make it fertile. James frowned at first, but decided to let her try. Weeks later, the small garden began to grow stronger than any patch of soil he had worked before. He realized then that she saw things he never noticed. Over time, James stopped thinking of her as the woman he bought. She was Nia. She was someone who carried skills he did not have, someone who helped turn a failing ranch into a place of survival. At night, when the fire burned low, he often wondered how much she had lost before she came into his life. Her silence was not emptiness, it was strength. The bond between them was still unspoken, fragile as the new crops in the soil, but it was growing. And though the town mocked him, James knew that the woman by his side was worth far more than the price of two. Bottles of whiskey and a sack of wheat, what neither of them knew yet was that the real test of their partnership and of Nia's hidden strength was still to come. The weeks passed slowly, and with each passing day, the life at the ranch became a little more settled, though not easier. James and Nia moved through their tasks with quiet rhythm. They rarely spoke more than a few words, but their actions told stories that words could not. He had learned to trust her judgment in small matters: where to plant, how to care for a sick calf, when to store water for the long days ahead. She in turn seemed to trust that he would not treat her as a possession but as a partner. Still, the outside world pressed in, and the whispers from the town grew louder with each visit. When James rode into town for supplies, he felt the weight of eyes on him. The saloon door would swing open and laughter would follow. A man at the bar might shout, "How's life with your Apache bride, James? Still got her under guard?" Another would add, "Don't turn your back, she'll stick a knife in you one night." The words were sharp, meant to wound, but James refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He gathered what he needed, paid, and left in silence. One afternoon, when he returned from town with flour and salt, he found Nia standing near the corral, her eyes following a hawk circling high above. She turned to him slowly, noticing the tension in his shoulders. Though she did not ask, she seemed to know what had been said. Her gaze lingered, steady and calm, as though reminding him that their lives were not built on the opinions of others. It was in that moment James realized that her silence carried more power than the cruelest words of men in town. Despite their growing bond, prejudice from the outside world continued to push against them. Carter, the same neighbor who had mocked James earlier, returned one evening. He leaned against the fence, his arms crossed, his face filled with disdain. "You're making a mistake," Carter warned. "Men are saying you've lost your mind. She'll never belong here. Folks don't trust her kind, and neither should you." James stood his ground. "She's done nothing but help this place. She's worth 10 men who only know how to talk." His voice was firm, his jaw tight. Nia, standing a few steps away, did not flinch at Carter's words. Instead, she picked up a bucket of water and carried it inside, her posture straight and unbroken. Carter sneered, spat in the dirt, and rode away, leaving behind a silence heavy with anger. That night, James sat by the fire, his hands clasped together. Finally he spoke, his words low. "They don't understand you. They don't want to." Nia looked at him, her dark eyes glowing in the firelight. Slowly, she spoke in broken English. People fear what they do not know. Her words were simple, but they struck deep. James nodded, realizing she had spoken the truth he had been circling in his mind for weeks. Over the following days, Nia began to reveal more of herself. While walking the land with James, she pointed to certain plants, teaching him their uses. A green leaf crushed between her fingers could soothe burns. The bark of a certain tree could be boiled into a drink for fever. She showed him where rabbits made their trails and how to follow them, how to read the ground for signs of deer, and how to know which berries were safe to eat. Her knowledge seemed endless, and James began to look at her with quiet admiration. One evening, as the sun fell behind the hills, Nia sat outside the cabin and began humming softly. The tune was unfamiliar to James, low and steady like the sound of the wind over the plains. He listened entranced until he asked gently, "What song is that?" She paused, then said, "My mother's song." Her eyes dropped to the ground, and for the first time James saw the deep well of sorrow within her. She spoke in halting words about her people, about the life that had been taken from her. Raiders, soldiers, traders, each had left scars on her journey. She had lost her family, her village, everything she had once called home. James listened in silence, his heart heavy. He realized that the woman beside him carried more pain than he could ever imagine, yet she bore it with grace. She did not weep or shout. She carried her grief like a stone she could never put down, yet she walked forward anyway. The town's hostility grew worse when news spread that Nia had been seen working on the ranch. Some claimed it was shameful for a white man to live with an Apache woman. Others warned that she would bring ruin. When James entered the general store one morning, the owner, an older man with a sharp tongue, said, "You'd better keep her away from here. My customers don't want to see her kind. She steps foot in my store and you'll both be out." James kept his anger quiet but his words firm. "I'll buy what I need and I'll pay fair. That's all you need to care about." The storekeeper grumbled but took his money, glaring the whole time. Back at the ranch, James shared little of what was said, but Nia seemed to know. She continued her work, her hands steady as she repaired a harness or gathered wood. Her strength became clearer every day. She was not just surviving, she was shaping the land, shaping their life together. One day a storm rolled in suddenly, the kind that swept across the plains with fierce winds and heavy rain. Lightning cracked across the sky, spooking the cattle. James ran into the corral, trying to calm them, but the animals bolted, nearly trampling him. Nia appeared at the fence, her voice sharp and commanding in her own language. She moved with surprising speed, guiding the cattle back into formation with nothing more than her steady presence and firm gestures. James watched in awe as she did what he could not, control chaos with calm. When the storm finally passed, the cattle were safe and the ranch stood unharmed. James looked at Nia, breathing heavily, his hat dripping with rain. "You saved us," he said simply. She only shook her head, her braids soaked, her face calm. "I saved what must live," she answered quietly. That night, James sat by the fire, his heart filled with gratitude and respect. He realized that Nia's worth could never be measured by what he had traded for her. She was not a burden or a mistake. She was the reason the ranch was holding together, the reason he still had hope. But he also knew that the outside world would never see her that way. The prejudice of the town was a shadow that would follow them. It was only a matter of time before that shadow grew darker, testing both of them in ways they could not yet imagine. The summer heat came early that year, drying the earth and leaving cracks in the soil around the ranch. The streams nearby began to shrink, and the grass in the pastures turned brittle under the hot sun. James had lived through droughts before, but this one felt heavier, as if the land itself was warning him of harder days ahead. He worried about the cattle, about the crops, and about how he and Nia would survive if the rains did not come soon. Yet as fear began to settle in his chest, he noticed that Nia moved through each day with calm purpose, as if she had known such struggles all her life. One morning, James woke to find her walking beyond the corral, her figure small against the wide horizon. He followed quietly, curious about what she was doing. She knelt near a patch of dry brush, her hands brushing the ground. With careful attention, she pointed to certain plants and then to the slope of the land. When James asked what she was looking at, she explained in her broken English, "Water. Hear it not far." He frowned at first, doubting her words. The earth looked hard and lifeless with no sign of moisture. Still, Nia insisted, and together they dug into the soil. To his surprise, they found dampness only a few feet down. With a little work, they created a shallow well that slowly filled with water. It was not much, but it was enough to keep their animals alive. That discovery gave James a new respect for Nia's knowledge. She seemed to understand the language of the land, a language he had never been able to hear. Over the next weeks, she showed him more. She taught him to watch the flight of birds, for they often circled above hidden water. She taught him to gather certain cactus fruits that could be eaten when all else failed. She knew how to use roots to make simple remedies for sickness, and she showed him which plants could help wounds heal faster. James realized she carried generations of wisdom within her, passed down from her people. But the challenges were not only from nature. One evening, as the sun dipped low, shadows stretched across the ranch. James spotted riders approaching, 3 men with hard faces and rifles slung across their shoulders. They were strangers, but their rough look told James all he needed to know. Rustlers, outlaws who came when men were weak, when the land was dry and cattle hungry. James stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting on his gun. Nia stood just behind him, her eyes sharp and watchful. The men stopped near the corral, their leader grinning as he called out, "Evening, cowboy. Heard you got yourself a fine ranch here. Shame if something happened to it." His tone was mocking, his eyes shifting toward the cattle. James stayed steady, though his heart pounded. "This land's mine," he said firmly. "And those cattle, too. You'd best keep riding." The men laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Don't be foolish," one of them said. "Times are hard. Share what you got, and maybe we'll leave you in peace." Before James could answer, Nia stepped forward, her expression calm but strong. She spoke in a low voice, quick and sharp in her own tongue. Though the men did not understand, her presence unsettled them. She carried herself with a strength that made them hesitate. Then she shifted into broken English, her words simple but clear. "This land, not weak, you leave." Her eyes did not blink, her voice steady as stone. The men shifted uneasily. They expected fear, but what they found was defiance. After a tense silence, the leader spat on the ground and jerked his reins. "We'll be back," he muttered before riding off into the darkening horizon. James exhaled slowly, realizing how close they had come to danger. He turned to Nia, ready to thank her, but she was already walking back toward the barn, calm as if nothing had happened. In the days that followed, James realized that Nia was more than a quiet partner on the ranch. She was a protector. She had eyes that noticed everything: the broken wire on the fence before cattle could escape, the faint trail left by men near the creek, the change in the air before a storm. He began to see her not as someone he had saved from the traitor, but as someone who had saved him many times over. One evening, as they sat by the fire, James asked softly, "Why do you stay? You could leave if you wished. You know the land better than I do. You could survive." Nia looked at him for a long time before answering. "You, not traitor. You give respect." Her words were few, but they carried weight. James nodded, understanding that trust had slowly grown between them, built not on promises but on actions. As the summer stretched on, the bond between them deepened. They began to share small moments that felt like a language of their own. She taught him her words, simple ones at first: sun, water, fire, sky. He repeated them clumsily, making her smile for the first time since she had come. In return, he taught her his words, helping her form sentences in English. It was slow, awkward work, but through it they found a way to understand each other better. One day, when the sky was clear and hot, James heard the sound of cattle bawling in the distance. He rode out quickly and found signs of rustlers nearby, hoof prints leading toward the canyon. Nia followed without hesitation, her bow slung across her back. Together they tracked the thieves, moving silently through the rocks until they found the stolen cattle. With quick thinking, Nia guided James into position. When the rustlers tried to drive the cattle away, she loosed an arrow that struck the dirt near their feet, startling them. James fired a warning shot into the air. The outlaws, realizing they were outmatched, fled into the hills, leaving the herd behind. As they drove the cattle back home, James looked at Nia with deep respect. "You saved everything I own," he said, his voice quiet. She shook her head. "Not yours alone, now. Ours." For the first time, James understood that she no longer saw herself as an outsider on his land. She had claimed it as her own, and in doing so, had claimed a place in his life. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars spread across the sky, James thought about the trade that had brought Nia to him. The town still whispered about the price he had paid, but he knew now that no measure of whiskey or wheat could capture her true worth. She was not a bargain. She was a partner, equal in strength and in spirit. The ranch still faced drought, threats, and the scorn of neighbors, but James felt a new kind of certainty. With Nia by his side, he believed they could face whatever the future held. What he did not yet know was that the hardest test was still to come, when the town itself would force him to choose between their judgment and his loyalty to the woman who had saved his life. The days of late summer slipped into autumn and the air grew cooler over the plains. The fields around James's ranch showed signs of new life, the garden Nia had planted pushing up green shoots in neat rows. For the first time in many seasons, James felt hope that the land could provide enough to see them through the winter. Yet even as things improved at home, trouble was gathering beyond the ranch. The town's gossip had not quieted. In fact, the stories about James and the Apache woman had grown louder, sharper, and more dangerous. One afternoon, James rode into town for flour, salt, and a few tools. As soon as he tied his horse outside the general store, he sensed the stares. Groups of men leaned against the posts, their voices dropping low as he passed. In the saloon, laughter carried through the open windows, laughter directed at him. He heard someone mutter, "That fool's living with a savage, it won't end well." James kept his jaw tight and said nothing, but he knew the resentment was no longer just whispers. It was turning into open hostility. The following evening, Carter and two other men rode to the edge of the ranch. Their faces were hard, their voices sharp. "James," Carter called, "we've had enough of this. The town won't stand for you keeping her here. You think you can bring trouble into our land and call it a home? It's an insult." His words were filled with hate, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. James stepped forward, his voice steady though his chest burned with anger. "This is my land. What happens here is no one's business but mine. She has done nothing to harm anyone." Carter sneered. "She's Apache. That's harm enough. You've blinded yourself. You trade good wheat and whiskey for a curse, and now you defend her as if she's worth gold." His companions murmured agreement, their eyes flashing with hostility. Before James could answer, Nia stepped out from the cabin. She stood tall, her braid falling over her shoulder, her dark eyes fixed on the men. Though her English was broken, her voice carried strength. "This home is strong. I help. I work. You see only hate." Her calm tone silenced the men for a moment. But then Carter laughed harshly. "You've taught her to speak our tongue, but it doesn't change what she is. She doesn't belong." The tension grew heavy in the air, and James's hand rested near his gun. But Nia laid her hand gently on his arm, steadying him. Her touch reminded him that violence would only prove the town right about their worst fears. Carter spat in the dirt and turned his horse. "This isn't over," he warned. Then they rode off, leaving dust and anger behind. The ranch felt uneasy after that night. James knew the men would not let things rest. He also knew that Nia's dignity and calm had unsettled them more than anything else could have. She had not shouted, nor had she begged. She had stood like a stone against the storm. Weeks later, the real test came. A group of rustlers swept into the valley under cover of night, their goal to drive off cattle from several ranches. Fires broke out near Carter's land, and the sound of gunshots echoed in the distance. James woke to the noise, his heart pounding. He rushed outside, rifle in hand, and saw shadows moving near his own corral. The outlaws were trying to cut the fence and drive his herd away. James fired a warning shot, and chaos broke out. Cattle bawled and stampeded, hooves thundering in the dirt. Nia appeared at his side, her bow in hand, her eyes sharp. Together they moved quickly, shouting, firing, and blocking the thieves' path. At one point, James was nearly thrown by a charging steer, but Nia's arrow struck the ground near its hooves, redirecting its path. Her movements were quick and sure, her courage steady. The fight lasted long into the night. When the rustlers finally fled, leaving behind frightened cattle and broken fences, James and Nia stood side by side, breathing heavily. They had protected the herd, and their ranch still stood. But the real surprise came at dawn, when Carter and his men rode up, their faces pale with exhaustion. Their ranch had been nearly ruined, and their cattle scattered. Carter looked at James, his pride wounded. "You held them off?" he asked, disbelief in his voice. James nodded. "We did. She saved this ranch more than I did." He gestured toward Nia, who stood quietly, her bow still in her hand. Carter looked at her, his mouth tight, but he said nothing. For the first time, his eyes held something other than scorn. It was not respect yet, but it was no longer pure hate. In the days that followed, word spread through town. People who had mocked James now whispered a different story. They spoke of how the Apache woman had defended the ranch, how her skill and courage had stopped the outlaws from taking everything. Some still muttered in anger, but others began to admit that perhaps she was not what they had believed. James thought often about the words, 2 drinks and a sack of wheat. The town had called it her price, laughing at his foolishness. But he knew now the truth. The whiskey and wheat had been nothing more than tokens. The real price he had paid was learning to see beyond the prejudice of others, to face their judgment and stand firm. And what he had gained in return was beyond measure. One quiet evening, as the sun set in gold over the horizon, James and Nia sat by the cabin fire. He turned to her and spoke softly. "They'll never understand, not fully. But I don't care anymore. You've given this place life. You've given me strength." Nia looked at him, her eyes calm, and for the first time in many weeks she allowed herself a small smile. "We give each other," she said. The wind carried the smoke from the fire into the sky, and James realized that everything had changed since that night in the saloon. He had thought he was making a trade, but in truth he had been given a gift he could never repay. The price of 2 drinks and a sack of wheat was not what had bought Nia. It was the cost of his own ignorance, burned away by the fire of her courage and the quiet power of her dignity. From that day forward, James no longer thought of Nia as someone he had taken home. She was not a bargain, not a possession, not a shadow in his cabin. She was his equal, his partner, and the soul of the ranch. Together, they stood against the whispers of the town and the trials of the land, proving that respect and trust were worth more than any trade, and that true worth could never be measured by what men thought was a fair price.